Aloha gang, this is section 11.2, which is operations with radical expressions or simplifying radical expressions. You can think of radicals as similar to variables in that if they're the same, you can combine them as like terms. So for example, instead of a radical 2, if this was like a x plus 3x, you would add your coefficients and get 4x. So in the same way, instead of having an x here, if you change this to a radical 2 and you change this one to radical 2, then you just change this and leave it as a 4 radical 2. So again, you just add the 1 and the 3 and then you leave the radical 2, and that's your answer. So you can combine them as long as they are the same radical. So here's our easy one. 5 radical 3 minus 8 radical 3. It's just 5 minus 8, which is negative 3, and then you leave the radical 3. Okay, if they don't have the same radicals, you cannot combine it, but radical 12 can be written as 4 times 3. Radical 4 times radical 3. And radical 4, or square root of 4, is 2. So it's radical 12 can be written as 2 radical 3. Now if I drop this 7 radical 3 down and I subtract it, now I got 7 radical 3 minus 2 radical 3, which is 5 radical 3. Okay, now they do have the same radical, so I can combine them because they're like terms. Okay. In the same way, if I have radical 27, I can rewrite that as radical 9 times radical 3. And I'm going to drop the 2 in front of it, so I know that I still have to multiply that. And then when I change this, it becomes a 3. So 2 times 3 and radical 3. So the radical 9 just became a 3. And when I multiply it, these two, I get 6 radical 3. So 2 radical 27 became 6 radical 3. Now when I drop this down, I get 3 radical 3 minus 6 radical 3. And 3 minus 6 is negative 3 radical 3. So I simplified that down to negative 3 radical 3. Okay, we're going to do some distributing and some foiling. Excuse me, so here it is. If I distribute this in like that we've done in the past, radical 3 times radical 6 becomes radical 18. You can just multiply them because they're both under the radical. And then 7, radical 3 times 7 is like saying x times 7, so instead of 7x, you put 7 radical 3. Because this is outside of the radical, you don't multiply it inside, underneath the radical. So you just leave it as 7 radical 3. This breaks down to 9 2, which becomes 3 radical 2, and then plus 7 radical 3. Because this is a radical 2 and this is a radical 3, I cannot combine them. They're not like terms. So I would just leave it at that. And that's simplified. That's as simplified as it can get. When I distribute this one, a radical times itself is whatever is on the radical without the radical. So for example, radical 3x times radical 3x becomes 3x without the radical. And I'll show you why. If I did multiply it, it would become radical 9x squared. And I could simplify that to radical 9 times radical x squared. Radical 9 is 3, radical x squared is x. So you can see how radical 3x times radical 3x just becomes 3x. Okay, so I'm just going to save time by just putting it here. So radical 3x times radical 3x is 3x minus, and since the 4y is on the outside, it just becomes 4y radical 3x. And just make sure your radical goes to the end of that x. And that is your answer. You cannot combine them. Because this 3x is outside of the radical, whereas this one is inside of the radical. Okay, when we do FOIL, the first times the first, radical 5 times radical 5 is 5, like I just explained. When I do the outside, 5 times radical 15, it becomes plus radical 75. And when I do the inside, because there's a minus here, it becomes minus 2 radical 75. Because 15 times 5 is radical 75, and then the 2 is on the outside. And then when I do the bottom one, this is where it gets a little tricky. the minus because it's negative times positive, and then it becomes 2 times 15 because there's 2's out here. So if I look at it this way, radical 15 times radical 15. So it's 2 radical 15 times radical 15. These two together just become 15. So I can actually drop this off if I want to show that. And it becomes 2 times 15, which you can see is going to be 30. So it becomes 5 plus. If I combine these two together, I have 1 radical 75 minus 2 radical 75. So it actually becomes minus radical 75 minus 30. Okay, this became your 30. Now I can combine the 5 minus 30, and that becomes negative 25. Oops, and I still gotta simplify a little more. So negative 25 minus, and the 75 I can break down to 25 and 3. So I'm gonna break this one down to 25 times 3, radical 25 times radical 3. And radical 25 just becomes 5 radical 3. So I can drop this down, and there is my answer. Negative 25 minus 5 radical 3. So this is how I got the negative 25. Okay, if you remember when we did these type of problems, if it was squared, a binomial squared, told you it was easier if you would just rewrite it twice and then FOIL it. So radical 7 times radical 7 is 7. And then plus 4 times radical 7 is 4 radical 7. Same thing here, plus 4 radical 7 again. And then this one becomes plus 16. So I can combine this one and this one, 7 and 16, to get 23. And I can combine these two together to get plus 8 radical 7. And there's your answer. You cannot combine it anymore. Okay, so that's how you distribute and FOIL. The last part is conjugates. I know it sounds like a weird one, weird word. Conjugate. What you want to do is create the same binomial, but you change the sign. So instead of 5, radical 5 minus radical 2, you put radical 5 plus radical 2. And you end up with what looks like a difference of squares. Just like when I had x minus 2, x plus 2. So it looks very similar. So when we do this and we FOIL, you can see we're starting out with some radicals, but watch what happens when we FOIL it. 5 times radical 5 times radical 5 is 5. This becomes plus radical 10. This becomes with the negative minus radical 10. And this becomes negative radical 2 times positive radical 2, which is minus 2. You can see just like how on difference of squares, the O and the I, or the middle terms, drop out because radical 10 minus radical 10 becomes 0. And you're just left with 5 minus 2, which is 3. So when you do a binomial times its conjugate, what happens is you end up with an answer that does not have radicals in it. So that's how you drop off the radicals. And the reason you do that is, for example, in this one, if I have 6 over radical 5 minus radical 2, I have radicals in my denominator, and that's not good. That's not simplified. I need to get rid of the radicals in the denominator. So what I do is multiply it by the conjugate, which is radical 5 plus radical 2. And then whatever I do to the bottom, I need to do to the top. So it's like multiplying it by 1. When I distribute the top, I'm left with 6 radical 5 plus 6 radical 2 over, and if you notice what I did was I took this here, it's the same thing. And so just all of this work here, I'm going to save time and move this 3 to the bottom. So I'm just saying this times this was equal to 3 according to what we did up here. Okay, all I did was save time. And so now I have this. But if you notice the numbers outside of the radical, I have a 6, and a 3. That can actually simplify down. Because if I wrote it this way, if I separated it and put this over 3 and this over 3, you can see that the 6 and the 3 can cancel down, and this 6 and the 3 can cancel down. Okay, and I would be left with a 2 and a 1 and a 2 and a 1. So I'd be left with 2 radical 5 plus 2 radical 2. Okay. So another way of showing it is just having the 6 radical 5 plus 6 radical 2 all over 3. And whatever I do to 1, I need to do to all 3 of them. Okay. So this becomes a 2, this becomes a 2, this becomes a 1. And you're left with 2 radical 5 plus 2 radical 2. And that's your answer. And you cannot combine it because the radical 5 and the radical 2 are not like terms. Okay, so one last one with the conjugate. I have negative 4 over radical 10 plus radical 8, so I'm going to multiply by the conjugate, which is radical 10 minus radical 8. Radical 10 minus radical 8. I'm going to distribute, and I get negative 4 radical 10 plus 4 radical 8, because negative 4 times a negative over here makes it a positive. When I do my f, I'm just going to do the f and the l FOIL because the middle terms would drop out. I will get over 10 minus, oops, should have been this one, 10 minus 8. Okay? Now, I don't know if you noticed it, but the radical 8 can actually be simplified because there is a perfect square factor in there, which is 4, because it's 4 times 2. So if I rewrite it, it would be 4 radical 10 plus 4 times 4 times radical 2. Okay, all I did was break down the radical 8 to that. And I'm going to subtract this already to 2. I'm going to change this one to a 2. So radical 4 is same as 2. So this is like saying 4 times 2 times radical 2. So I can actually simplify that to 8 radical 2 all over 2. And in the same way where I cancel down over here, all 3 of them, I can cancel down over here and divide everything by a 2. So I'm going to get a 2 here, a 4 here, and a 1 here. And the over 1 just drops out. So I'm left with negative 2 radical 10 plus 4 radical 2. And that can simplify because the radical 10 and the radical 2 are not like terms. There are no perfect square factors under the radical, so it's simplified. And there's no radical in the denominator like there was here. So again, you cannot have a radical in the denominator. Okay, so you can see how we changed it by multiplying by the conjugate to simplify it here. That is how you simplify radicals. Hope you have a wonderful day.